Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on unions' responses to COVID-19, a transatlantic perspective. I'm Alex Colvin. I'm Dean of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. Today's webinar is an effort to address one of the major challenges around the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's looking at the economic impact of the pandemic and the role of unions in securing worker interests in the efforts to respond to the pandemic through stimulus packages. I want to start by thanking the organizers who put together this session today, particularly to Dina Bashara, who initiated it, and also to my colleagues here, Ian Greer, Jeff Grabelski, and D.H. Goodall. I also want to thank the Worker Institute, part of the ILR school, that's been helping organize this, and our friends and colleagues in the Transatlantic Social Dialogue and at the Solidarity Center. The COVID-19 pandemic is a public health crisis. We all know that. That's been affecting what we're doing to try and respond to that public health crisis. But its impact has also produced an economic crisis. Governments have enacted stimulus packages in response to the vast size and impact of the economic impacts of the pandemic, designed to protect the economies of nations. But the question we want to ask is, what's the role of labor in these efforts? How are worker institutes represented or not represented in the stimulus packages? We're going to be discussing a series of questions around this. What are the important concessions workers have gotten in the stimulus packages of different countries? What concessions did workers get beyond those stimulus packages? And what role did unions play in influencing the provisions that went into the packages? And more generally, what obstacles are unions facing in advancing workers' rights in response to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? Today, we've got a fantastic panel of labor leaders from both North America and Europe to discuss these questions, a true transatlantic panel that we'll be hearing from today. I'd like to introduce the panelists we have with us today. Firstly, Liz Schuler, who's the Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, the National Union Federation here in the United States. Liz originally comes out of the IBEW, but currently serves as Secretary-Treasurer at the AFL-CIO, which is the second highest position in the labor movement here, where she serves as the Chief Financial Officer of the Federation and oversees operations. She was the first woman elected to this position in the AFL-CIO. Secondly, Horst Mund, who is the Director of Transnational Trade Union Policy Department at IG Metall, the union for the metalworking industries, which is Germany's largest union. He previously served as the coordinator of the International Trade Union Program of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and also served as the head of division for the German Confederation of Trade Unions, responsible for Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Thirdly, Lisa Lotte Toft, who is head of division for international affairs at the Danish Trade Union Confederation, who's been closely working on the COVID-19 issues there. She has previously worked for a number of Danish ministries with a focus on international policy development, and also was posted to Brussels working on EU institutions. And then fourthly, Angelo Di Cristo, who's the head of Uni Finance at Uni Global Union, which represents 20 million service sector workers in 150 countries worldwide. It's the global union for all bank, insurance, and central bank employees. Uni Finance represents 3 million workers in over 250 trade unions. Angelo's from Italy, where he has over 30 years of experience in the trade union movement there. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this webinar. We're using the webinar format on Zoom. So under this format, the speakers will do their presentations, then we'll have a Q&A session. In Zoom, in the webinar format, there's a button at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. It says Q&A. You can use that to ask questions. If you click on it, you can type in your questions and we'll respond to those in the Q&A portion of the webinar. So to start off our discussion today, I'm going to turn to Liz Schuler, who's going to give our kickoff presentation. Liz.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean Colvin. I want to thank you, of course, the ILR School, the Worker Institute, all of the organizers who brought us together this morning, because these exchanges are so important in this time where we all feel so far apart. Bringing us together is absolutely critical. So I want to thank you for that, and hope everyone is safe and healthy. I always like to start every Zoom call with that, because I don't think we can take that for granted in these times. And also glad to be here with all of my colleagues. We in the US can learn a lot from what's happening overseas. And so wanted to thank Horst, of course, from Ig Metall. We have a long partnership, particularly in the auto industries. So thank you for that. Certainly Angelo and Uni. As was mentioned, as a federation, you also do so much critical work, not only in the finance sector, but also we rely on you in communications and retail and service, and most particularly the gig economy now. And Lisa, it's nice to meet you as well. I've been to Denmark a few times, particularly working with the Danish Trade Union Confederation, our counterpart there in the offshore wind sector. So we work together quite well, and this is no exception, even though the COVID crisis, of course, is unlike anything we've ever seen or dealt with before in any of our countries. And the labor movement, of course, in the US is responding in what I often refer to as the tale of two working worlds. Because we have the workers who are on the front lines, who are making sacrifices, working insane hours, exposing themselves to, threat. And then we have also the second world, which is the group of workers who are now finding themselves unemployed overnight because of the virus. And really both worlds are struggling right now. And the folks who are working around the clock across the country to keep people safe from this disease, whether it's in our healthcare system or in other frontline capacities at the grocery store, transportation, the list goes on and on. It's really quite illuminating to think about workers in unions versus those who are not yet in unions, and how the crisis has played out. And I like to use the example of the grocery industry. You see grocery stores like Whole Foods, for example, that's owned by Amazon. And when a Whole Foods worker tests positive for COVID-19, the store does not close for sanitation. The only option for those employees is to take unpaid leave at their peril, basically. But grocery workers in a union store have a very different experience. And you know that UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers, is the largest union in the US representing grocery workers. And they were actually able to work with a store like Kroger to expand emergency benefits. And so now they have actually premium pay. They negotiated a $2 an hour wage increase. They have, and that then lifts all of the standards in the rest of the industry, right? It leads the industry. They have protections like plexiglass at the checkouts, where they can actually social distance from the customers. And it's heartbreaking that the companies are actually leaning on the unions to adjust customer behavior. I don't know if you've seen a recent campaign they did where they're saying, wear masks as a customer, stay 2 shopping carts away from each other, because the companies don't want to alienate customers. They're asking the union to actually put these safety precautions out there for the public. Also, we cannot forget, as I said, this second world of workers who have lost their jobs because of the virus. And it's staggering to hear the numbers of unemployed workers. We are now more than 26 million Americans have lost their jobs just in the last 4 weeks. And we know that many more will lose their jobs before this crisis is over. And it's really easy to start being negative and, you know, get in this sort of downward spiral because of everything we're dealing with here. But even with the struggles that so many Americans are facing, I have a glimmer of hope. And we had seen a lot of momentum before the crisis of workers rising up because the economy was already broken, and the crisis has just essentially exposed the cracks that were underneath the surface. But before the crisis, the US approval for unions actually was at 64%. It was the highest in nearly 50 years. And more than 60 million workers said if they had the chance that they would join a union. So this crisis is actually creating a new impetus to organize. And we're seeing those efforts crop up from all over the economy, in particular the banking sector, which I'm sure we'll hear more about, the gaming industry, etc. So I love to see these Amazon workers and Instacart workers as well joining together in new ways. So I think it's a symptom of hopefully a larger approach that we will see as this crisis evolves, what we will be able to do in terms of organizing workers. I know that it's been a bit of a different story in other countries. I know that Germany and Denmark are slowly reopening businesses and schools. I want to hear, of course, from my colleagues on that and what we can do to learn from you and how to make that happen safely. It's no surprise, though, to me that countries that support the system of social dialogue actually have workers at the table. And so your path to recovery, we think, is going to be a model, right? And that's something that the US should learn from other countries' experiences. And so I'll close with this so that we can turn it over to the panelists, but we have a lot to learn from other countries' experiences. And as I said earlier, the virus has exposed the gaping holes in our economy that were already there, but now they're front and center. And it really brings new urgency to the labor movement's global priorities, this idea of rebuilding a social contract. This has been a priority for a long time, but particularly the International Trade Union Confederation. What does that look like? You know, worker guarantees for their fundamental rights, an adequate minimum wage, maximum working hours, health and safety standards, including addressing gender-based violence. And what about universal social protection, making sure that workers have income protections during times of high unemployment? And we've actually been meeting with global brands to make sure that they're living up to their commitments to workers throughout the supply chain. So the bottom line here is that we're all in this together. And in the coming weeks and months ahead, the labor movement's response should be what we do best. And that is to join together and meet people's immediate needs, like food assistance that we're seeing right in front of us, but also coming together to rewrite the rules of the economy for all working people. And one where workers have security, job security, health security, retirement security, and that when we stand together, that's how we win. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Great, thanks very much. You know, I think as you say, the impact on the U.S. is vast. We have seen 26 million unemployed in 4 weeks. It's just a staggering number. I mean, we've never seen a number that quick, that fast. But you know, we're hoping to think about what the policy responses could be and learn from this transatlantic dialogue that we're going to have today. So. Let me turn over to Horst Mund to start us off from hearing about what's going on in Europe and in particular in Germany. Horst.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you also for the invitation, and I'm glad I can join you all. If there is one positive, in big inverted commas, element on all this COVID pandemic is that we increasingly get used to smart and inexpensive formats of interaction like the one we are in now. And I hope that really stays, because it enables us to get wiser and more intelligent by simply talking to each other much easier than we have been used to. I will give you the perspective of my union, the Metalworkers Union of Germany. So while the challenges of labor in Germany or any other countries are very similar, it is definitely a focus on IG Metall's perspective. Now let me share my screen with you. I prepared a few slides, and let's see if I... So, okay, so here we are. These are the depressing figures that we see every day. Cases of infection, death cases, death ratio. So I just jump over that, but it shows the magnitude of the disease and the way it has affected us. Let me briefly talk about the situation that we are in Germany, in particular, as I said, in IG Metall. So roughly 25% of working people in the metal sector work in home office now. Another 25%, 1/4, is on short-time work. I will talk about that later, whatever that means. Half of working people in our sectors do still work in factories, in offices, and so forth. And it's clear you can't build cars at home. So that's a major challenge for the manufacturing industry. We have this instrument in Germany for a long time in labor market policy of short-time work. And until last week, Monday, more than 700,000 companies have applied for funding from the Federal Agency of Labor for short-time work allowances. So that will give us a figure of roughly 4 million employees. That is then the, let's say, these are figures for the entire economy. And if that is going to happen, it will be more or less double the figure that we had 10 years ago in the Lehman Brothers crisis. So like many other countries, US, Denmark, and so forth, our government has put in place protective umbrellas, economic stabilization funds. I can go into further detail if interest be. So is to the tune of more than 600 billion euro right now, and it is growing. Particular focus is on small and medium size enterprises. Here there is a government guarantee of 100% of loan default in order to speed up the processing of loan applications. Still not too many insolvencies in Germany because of amendments to the insolvency legislation. I hope there is no question on that, because that would go beyond my expertise. And we can say that for the time being, unemployment is not growing as fast as in other countries. Automatic stabilizers do work. If there is interest, I could also talk about what is done at the European level. I don't do that in my first round. But I would say that we've asked our members how they perceive the situation, and we got a feedback only at the weekend from roughly 5,000 companies where we do have members. And out of these 5,000 companies, 70% of them had applied for short-time work. 10% reported serious liquidity problems, And a further 15% said that they would expect liquidity problems with the risk of insolvency later in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So that shows the situation we're in. So what did we do as IG Metall when the crisis hit the ground in Germany, in Europe? So by February, early March, we said, okay, it's all about securing employment and income. So we said we focus on basically 3 elements. It's the short-time work that needs to be expanded and improved. We need to secure cash, the cash flow for the companies, and in the medium to long run, we need to stimulate the economy. Then this painstakingly slow process of social dialogue starts, a lot of discussions, so social partner meetings, that is labor unions, employers federations, federal government under the leadership of Chancellor Merkel, meet and discuss. Each and everybody formulates his or her expectations, and then by and large and gradually agreements are reached. This all happened while we were in a major collective bargaining round for the metal and electrical industry, mainly car. We said we did not stop this, but we would rather continue, of course, taking into consideration the exceptional situation we're in. After very few discussion and negotiation rounds, we reached an agreement, and we could sort of revive a contract that we had concluded 10 years ago after the financial crisis, which we called Future in Work 2020. And we agreed that there would be no dismissals during the validity of the agreement. It's valid until December 2020, so for the next 8 months or so. There will be no wage increase. That's a concession we had to make. There will be a division of the already agreed on bonuses for Christmas and holidays. They will be divided into 12. That would increase the net or the monthly income, and that is important because the monthly income is the basis for the calculation of the short-time work allowance that you are entitled to. So if you could increase it through this redivision, then your entitlement also grows. A lot of sectoral meetings also happen, particularly in the car industry. Discussions about stimuluses, how the demand that has completely fell down to almost zero could be revived. So you may remember the cash and clunkers thing that we had, that you also had in the US at least 10 years ago. Something of that sort might be reinvented, in brackets, taken into consideration the climate change discussion that we are in, maybe privileged subsidies for electrical cars and so forth, so that remains to be seen. 2 more minutes. Short-time work. Companies may apply at the federal agency for short-time work in exceptional cases, and we are in an exceptional situation. So the government takes over the payment of 60% of the net wage, or 67 if there's if the employee has a family, and that means that you will lose 40% of your income, and that is something that we did find completely unacceptable. So that was a demand that we as labor unions in Germany unanimously said should be at the center stage of our demand. So we launched a quick and dirty campaign with ads. We bought time and space in media. We wrote to all our MPs and said, look, there's a serious flaw in crisis, the way we address the crisis if that is not taken care of. And we were successful. It was only last week that government agreed, and they agreed to our demand. I wouldn't say 100%, because 100% would have meant that immediately you go to the 80 or 87% of your last income in terms of allowance. But there is a sort of phasing in. For the first 3 months, it will stay the way it is, 60, 67%. Then months 4 to 6, it will be 70 and 77%. And for the last, or then onwards, it will be the 80 and 87%. So I would say that was really very successful, in the sense that what we demanded, we almost got, and partly I think that was due that we focused on that element. There are other elements, of course, but that was something that we were quite successful on. I don't want to talk about gradually reopening the economy now. Maybe we can do this in the second round, but as Liz already indicated, there are quite complex discussions. So many aspects need to be taken into consideration, health considerations foremost, but also economic. Then what does that do to the society that is locked down for so many weeks now, and all that? So that we may do in the second round. I thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Horst. Fascinating report there. It's interesting to note that in the United States, there's been have been some efforts to put in place a parallel version of a work sharing program through the unemployment insurance system here, not with the same kind of social partnership, and so much less widespread in usage. But an example of kind of the influence of the German model transnationally. Now I want to turn to Liselotte Toft to make a few comments from the Danish perspective.
It's okay?
Yes, we can hear
thank you. Well, thank you also very much for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's an extremely important topic, and a time where we're all asking ourselves how we will come out of this crisis. I was asked to share with you a bit of the background and the content of the tripartite agreement on temporary wage compensation, which was agreed among the social partners and the government 15th of March. I've prepared a short presentation. Maybe I should go through that now. I have forwarded it to you, so you have prepared it already. Yeah. So I think let's move on to page number 1, because I think first of all, facts about Denmark. We are a very small country compared to the US and Germany, for instance. 5.7 million people, 5.8, sorry. And we've actually had economic upswing for the past 5 years. So it was very optimistic times in February, and now we are looking at a recession, and people are gradually getting unemployed. We're not looking at millions, of course, as in the US, but it has risen 25% since 1st of March. Let's move on to the foundation of the Danish labor market, because to understand a bit what are the fundamentals of our labor market, it is characterized by a very exclusive role of the social partners, with very strong ownership and responsibility based on mutual recognition. So conditions, wages, working conditions, they are primarily regulated through collective agreements between the social partners. The government do not interfere. And that's a very important point, that lots of things are just agreed among the social partners. However, if we have social issues, societal challenges, which are actually linked to some general conditions, the social partners agree with the government to make tripartite agreements. And just to complement a bit on the Danish model, we have what we call flexicurity. Basically, flexicurity is about ensuring a high level of education and lifelong learning. And then we have very active labor market policy in relation to jobs. We have job centers helping people to find jobs, so we have very high job mobility. 1 out of 4 Danes every year change jobs, and this is complemented by high income support in case of unemployment. So we have a very strong social security system combined with very high job mobility, and it's quite easy to hire and fire, if I can use those words. So that's sort of the dynamics of the Danish labor market. So just the next slide, just more information about what I just repetition actually, that the Danish government will intervene as little as possible in labor market issues. Next slide. On 11th of March, our Prime Minister, she closed down Denmark. There was this Flow TV broadcasting where everybody was looking, and she said now everybody needs to listen because there will be big changes for everybody, and everything was closed down. Schools, people were encouraged to stay at home, all the public employees were asked to stay at home, and so forth. This was the 11th of March, and then on the 14th of March, the government and the social partners came up with this tripartite agreement. Basically, completely the same background as we just heard from Germany. It's about making companies survive and keeping employees safe. And already, so the idea was for 3 months, I've already forwarded you the content of the agreement, but for 3 months, companies can seek wage compensation up to 30,000 kroner a month, which equals 4,000 euros. So it's quite a high salary, and the condition is not to fire people, to get rid of the employees. Next slide. This is more about the details of the tripartite agreement, and we have had some very good experience with trying to interpret on this agreement, because as you can see from the interpreted agreement that I forwarded, it's less than 2 pages, and you can imagine there are so many situations coming out of this agreement where people ask, but what if I stay at home, and I mean, there's so many concrete questions which came after the agreement, and I think the government and the social partners spent lots of time trying to sort of fill out the holes, and this work is still going on. Next page. As I said, it's 4,000 euros a month, and at the moment the agreement has been extended till beginning of July, so companies can apply until the beginning of July. We already have a discussion going on in relation to the control of the companies. I think that might also happen in Germany. I mean, to sort of prove that they actually pay their employees the salaries and that they still pay taxes and so forth. So there's this whole control scheme discussion going on at the same time. Next page. As we speak, I just looked up the numbers today, and it has risen actually, because approximately 222,000 employees are now part of this wage compensation scheme, which is quite a lot compared to the total number of employees in Denmark. And more than 25,000 companies have applied for the state wage compensation. I have not included a slide on the other stimulus measures, but we have a lot of stimulus measures complementing this temporary wage compensation scheme. Because after this first tripartite agreement, then they came up with, what about the independent author or artist, or what about the young people who cannot get a job, and what about theaters, what about the whole cultural life, and so forth. So there's been this sort of Christmas tree, you might call it, of stimulus packages popping up after this huge tripartite agreement. And we do not believe that it's over, because people are, right now there's this discussion about, what about the Germans who wants to go to summer houses in Denmark and cannot come to Denmark? What about the people renting out summer houses? Shouldn't they have some sort of compensation as well? So it's just to say, to inform you about the battle that's still going on. I think that was more or less what I wanted to share at the moment concerning the tripartite agreement.
Great. Thanks very much. Yeah, very interesting to hear the perspective from how the Danish system, very similar in some ways to the German response, but also with its own distinctive way of doing it. But before we turn to Angelo, I wanted to remind our listeners that you could put in questions under the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll be answering those after his presentation. So next, though, I want to turn to Angelo De Cristo from Uni Global for his remarks. Angelo?
Okay. Hello. Thank you very much for having me in this to invite me to this webinar. As you introduced me, I'm Italian, and then talking about what's going on in Italy. That, you know, the pandemic situation is the second largest country with a lot of deaths and a number of cases. I know Italy is coming from a strong, and then I will give you an overview about at the global level what's going on. Italy has a very strong tradition of negotiation, in the sense that from 50 years, because the 20th of May we will celebrate 50 years of the Statute of Workers, and that is a big achievement. And this statute give let me say, give the freedom of association, trade union liberties, and also how workers must be is allowed. Let me say, is a labor law made in the 70s, on the 20th of May of the 70s, and this give the opportunity to the trade union. And this law is coming from a huge struggle during the end of 1969 between the unions and the government, and then at the end was achieved. And then someone tried during this year to destroy it, let me say, starting from Berlusconi. And then is a pity to say, then a government of center left keep out one fundamental part of this law. Not on trade union representation or trade union freedom. This gives the opportunity to the trade unions to have a very strong tradition of negotiation at the, let me say, government level, sectorial, national sectorial level, and then at the company level. We don't have the system that is the German one. We don't have the co-determination. In Italy, there is only negotiation within the unions. Why? Because the unions are strong. Because there is a big density of union member in the different sector. I can give you the example of the finance sector, that over 400,000 workers all around Italy, the 75% of the people is member of one union, member of a union. Then I have to say also, to give you the picture, that in Italy there is a pluralistic system of union. There are more than one union, but when they are in the sector or at the national level, they work together. They represent the worker front together. In Italy, the main unions are CGIL, CISL, and WIL. That are the three confederations. They work together at the moment. In this moment, they are working together at the national level, and they are working together in the sectoral level and at the company level. And then finance sector is one of the highly unionized sector in my country, and in this sector there are four unions. There is only one independent union, but they are working together. They have made a lot of let me say negotiation at the national level with the government. The three confederation, for example, one was made last Friday, because from May 4 will be the second phase of the lockdown. They will reopen some industry. They will reopen some retail, not in a large scale, but they have dealt how to reopen, what kind of protection the workers must have, and what kind of responsibility let me say the employer must have in a relation of this. In the finance sector, after the first agreement that was made on March 9, you have to take in mind that the finance sector, almost in all over the world, is considered essential workers, because the banks, the branch are open, and let me say the employee are going in the branch to make their job. In Italy, they made at the national sectorial level for the banking sector, but also for the insurance sector, two protocols with the employer association to guarantee the protection for the workers. And for example, in Italy, there is a very tight lockdown, and then the people find the excuse to go to the bank branch. Some of them elder people. Then was the situation that they had meetings into the branch bank. And then the unions asked to the government to regulate, and then to find a way, and to allow the people to go to the bank branches. And they find the solution that you can go to the branch only by appointment, because you can use other channels, for example, to withdraw money or to know how is your amount on your account. Important thing, for example, they agree also on pay leave for workers with care responsibility. You know, also the schools were completely shut down, and then a lot of people need to stay home because to have care about the kids. And pay leave for vulnerable workers, for example, pregnant and all other high-risk people with previous disease that are under high risk. Then remote working possibility. For example, they agreed with a lot of companies to allow the people to work home and to buy for them the devices, because a lot of people don't have the devices to be used in the finance sector. And then temporary unemployment funds for the people that cannot work from home, because they don't have the possibility to work from home, or they are in a rotation team working in the branch, in the sense that all the branches, every week, they will change the team of workers who is going to the branch. And then for 1 week, another team of people stay home and then return back to the same branch. And then let me say, more or less the same situation in the finance sector is almost the same where we have a strong trade union representation. And for us as UNI, and as Liz mentioned before, we are working also in the US, and we are working with FEL-CIO member, that is CWA, and how we can strengthen in this moment the trade union density, because I heard before this webinar we are discussing about the density of the trade union, and Liz say that in the US something is moving in the sense that the people now has the willing to be represented by a trade union. This is not the same in Europe, where from the trade union the people expect that the trade union do something, is granted. And I'm happy that to listen that in the US something is changing. I know a little bit about US, but I know also it's not an easy field. We are working on a campaign, not only in the finance, but finance. If you think that 1/3 of the global staff is in the US, that means more than 1 million people working for the finance sector in the US and don't have any trade union representation. For us, it's very important to start to do this. And then we have some news about in the US about the company that are taking this kind of measures, for example, to decide which branch to close without informing the people, the colleagues, which measures will be taken, which people is going to work, without an intermediation, without a negotiation, a proper negotiation with the worker representative. Also, in the rest of the world, for the finance sector, this, I think, for the companies, this is the risk that we are running for the companies, was let me say, maybe is not the wrong, the right word to say, but also for the company, this pandemic situation is a gift, because in a couple of weeks they are experimenting what they would like to experiment in the next years. If you think that they have closed branches, they have reduced staff, they have sent more, for example, in the Italian collective agreement in the banking sector, teleworking is allowed only for 10 days a month. Because now, let me say, the 80% of the banking staff in Italy is working from home on 300,000 workers. The 80%, the rest are in the branches, or someone is not working because they cannot do the job from home or do it by teleworking. Our concerns is that the company will take an advantage on this. They will return back and say, okay, we can do the same business using less people. This is one of my concerns, and for this is important solidarity. Solidarity must be not only a word in this moment. Solidarity must be the word for after the crisis. Because we must be united on this. Because as trade union, we have to give one response to the employers. I'm talking about the finance sector. We are leading this problem because we have this, and only with strong unions, with new unions, we can do this. because without let me say a union presence, a union let me say present among the workers is impossible to achieve. And for us is also important that also the business the business orientation of the financial industry must change, because they have not learned nothing from the 2007-2008 crisis, and they cannot do the same after this crisis. We have to build together a new social pact, a new social agreement around the world.
Great. Great. Thanks, Angelo. That's a rousing call, I think, for us to really think seriously about what the fallout is going to be from this crisis. Crises are opportunities for change, as well as challenges to us. I also want to pick up your comments about the importance of thinking about the workplace level as well as the broader societal level, and the importance of worker voice in negotiating how we open up workplaces and ensure the safety and health of workers. This is something that in the United States we're seeing an upsurge of job actions around health and safety issues. I think something that's one of the noticeable things in this crisis, where we're seeing workers in workplaces where there is no representation even taking things into their own hands and walking off the job. And I think that's one of the more significant developments we've seen in the United States. We have some time now for some Q&A. We're going to open it up to the audience to pose some questions for our panel. After we do that, I'll turn it back to Liz Schuler to make some concluding remarks, but we've got about 25 minutes or so for Q&A. I'm going to turn over to my colleague Ian Greer, who's going to relay some questions from the audience to the panel. Ian, do we have some questions for the panel?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. We have a lot of questions, so I will just tell the panelists, I'll summarize them for the panelists, and then I think you guys should just do a round answering whatever questions you want to answer. There will probably be too many for you to answer all of them that apply to you. But a few of them related to specific groups, normally groups that fall through the cracks in industrial relations and social policy. So migrant workers, gig workers, are there any policies that support those people in innovative ways? And what about union work with non-union organizations that advocate for them? And yeah, also disabled people, young people. Is there anything new and innovative going on at a policy level or at a kind of a coalition building level? There was a question about kind of comparing the policies in different countries. I think there's a few of us would like to know kind of the role of the social partners in the CARES Act and what's going on in the United States, in particular whether work sharing and short-time compensation schemes have been a prominent part of the discussion in the United States. There was also a question about what's going on in Denmark. One person noted that 70,000 people does not seem like very many people covered by your scheme. It sounded much bigger the way you were describing it, even in the context of a small country like Denmark. There was a surprise with how few people that covered. And I guess also with Denmark, there's a question, well, why that? Why not short-time working like in Germany? There's a question beyond kind of emergency measures and new policies to deal with that. Are there any ideas for innovative policies after the crisis, economic strategies for new economic and social policies after the crisis? So if anyone has any thoughts about that, that would be very interesting to hear about. There was a number of questions about what goes on at the workplace. For example, someone asked about conversion strategies, if any important lessons have been learned from these stories of converting industrial production to making PPE and other ventilators. There's also a question about wildcat strikes, especially people who are not covered by collective bargaining. There are stories of these unauthorized kinds of very grassroots strikes becoming increasingly important. So there's a question, well, what's going on in your country with those? What's the relationship with established unions to those groups organizing? And then the final group of questions I'd like to mention is about employer protections employer attempts to loosen worker protections. Someone mentioned working time. I can imagine that is very difficult to police for a lot of workers in a time like this. So are there efforts by employers to get around certain worker protections like working time protections, and also are there interesting ways of making sure people are getting hazard pay or introducing it for people who didn't have it before? So that's my summary of what people have asked. I say the panelists do another round. Maybe it should go in the order in which you guys spoke the first time. So why don't you start, Liz?
Sure, there's a lot to digest there. And I think, the CARES Act, which was the legislation that passed, that was referred to earlier, there were a number of bills that Congress had to come up with in short order, and the labor movement basically got together very quickly and tried to prioritize. I think it was Horst that said, they focused on one thing, which was probably smart, because in the labor movement here, we had a very long list of things that are demands to Congress, and we did come up short. There were some wins and there were some losses. And, I think the one thing that we can point to is the unemployment insurance expansion for workers here in the US. And each worker, of course, will get an additional $600 in their weekly benefit checks for 4 months. The unemployment insurance system got $250 billion additional dollars. But the one thing that was unique about this is, for the first time ever, it included so-called gig workers, the workers who normally wouldn't have an employer that they're working with that has an employer-employee relationship, were found to be eligible this time. And through the advocacy of working people, we wanted to make sure that every worker could access the unemployment insurance system. So that was the win. There's a lot of disappointment, however, on the oversight of the billions and billions of dollars that are going to be going to large corporations. Obviously, the airline industry was successful in getting some strings attached to make sure if an airline takes advantage of relief, that it has to go to preserving payroll and keeping workers paid and with their health insurance. And then, of course, the hospitals received money, transit received money, and I think the paycheck protection piece was one of the most troubling, where a lot of companies, as you've probably seen in the news, large companies that actually didn't need the emergency relief were gobbling up all this money that left smaller businesses high and dry. And so that's where this latest round of funding just last week came into play. I will tell you, in the labor movement, there are a lot of folks who believe that, each time we go to the well, that the companies are the winners. And it's just like every time we've seen in history where the government comes to the rescue and relief of corporations, but workers end up getting the short end of the stick. So we are working now fiercely with leaders in the House to put together, and we have put together some model legislation that when the time comes for the next round of CARES Act 2, they call it, the next relief package will be inclusive and workers first. And I will say we've kind of, to make sure we're very focused this time, we've boiled it down to 5 things, right? The first thing is that frontline workers must be safe, and that we have to have an infectious disease standard that mandates that companies are prepared for this kind of disaster and provide the personal protective equipment that workers need. The second thing is to keep workers employed and protect earned pension checks, because retirement security is now at risk in this crisis, and I'm sure folks all across the globe are looking at this. The third thing is to keep state and local governments, public schools, and the U.S. Postal Service solvent and working. This is a trickle down, as they say, all throughout a supply chain, including our state and local governments who find their coffers starting to wane. The fourth thing is keeping America healthy, protect and expand health insurance for all workers, because health insurance is tied to employment, that we have millions of people who find themselves without health insurance when they lost their jobs. That cannot be. And finally, keeping America competitive, which is this whole promise to start investing in things like infrastructure, where we're going to rebuild the systems in our country that can also create jobs. So those are the things we're focusing on as a labor movement to make sure working people actually benefit from the investments our government's going to make in this next round.
Okay, Horst, you're on.
Good to see you, Ian. Well, I'm sure your beard is not a consequence of the corona pandemic. You must have started growing it much earlier. Good to see you after quite a while. Now, I was afraid that I should perform some kind of multitasking effort by following the discussion and interventions, and also the questions that were asked, and which I could also follow on the screen. I would have failed completely. So I'm grateful that you try to coordinate it. So let me try to address some of the issues that you have raised. Wildcat Strikes first. I don't see, or we don't see any Wildcat Strikes in Germany. It's not part of our culture anyway. So this is not happening now, at least not in Germany. Specific programs to cultural and gig workers were mentioned. Well, we have to see that those or most of the instruments that are put in place in Germany in terms of labor market policy are addressed to employees, so employed people. And well, many of the cultural workers, artists, or you have your gallery, or you are a rowdy that accompany artists on tours and so forth. Many of them are self-employed. So they would not qualify for these kind of support mechanisms I just described. That is why additional instruments have been put into place. I'm afraid the gig worker would not profit from them, because well, the majority, at least here in Germany, they would not even have, let's say, their enterprise, one-person enterprise registered. So they would find it extremely difficult to get any form of support. Unlike cultural workers, where we have some, well, emergency instruments in place. So for instance, if you are accompany an artist on her or his tour, which you can't do right now, you would get some kind of liquidity support, something to the tune of 10,000 euro for 3 months, which would pay your bills at least for 3 months. But we already 2 months now down the road. So what happens in May, June, July, we don't know. There is further discussion on that, but let's face it, they are at the lower end of protection. And the same thing I would say can be said about migrant workers. As long as they are part of the social security system, which many are in Germany, they would be covered by what I just described earlier. We've closed the borders, for instance, for people in the agricultural sector, helping harvesting. Now is the asparagus season, blah, blah, blah. And we have gradually now reopened it for some. And they would not be covered by this because they would be working anyway. But refugees who have come to Germany, who stay here, they would not be covered by labor market instruments because most of them are not even allowed to work. So that is a different story here. Conversion of production, PPEs and all the rest of it, role of labor unions, not a specific one. But as we are, well, at the shop floor level, usually in close contact with management through our works council and our shop stewards, so I would assume that there is a high degree of interaction and participation. Finally, I asked one question which may not even have been asked, but I think the point is extremely important, and Angelo made it in his intervention. Now is and also Liz talked about it, now is the time when new narratives are created about the way our economies function, how the international interaction functions, global or regional value chains, the distribution question and so forth. And what we see, for instance, in Germany is that people realize how those working in hospitals are paid so low, and now they have to perform extraordinary jobs. So I'm sure you've had this in your countries as well. So everyone is applauding workers. 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the evening, everyone is standing on the balcony. So wonderful, people in the hospitals appreciate it to a certain degree, but we've heard increasingly angry voices by the nurses and doctors and what have you say, look, applause is one thing, but just get us decent pay. So, and then you have a discourse that you can't pay nurses decently if you have privatized the public health system, and where you make hospitals private enterprises which look into paying dividends to its shareholders. So there is, I think, at least the opportunity. If we seize it, it remains to be seen, but there is the opportunity to, well, have a new discussion and maybe also a good decisions in the sense that we pay those people what they actually deserve. I could also talk about, let's say, the global division of labor in terms of value chains in industry, but that I will spare maybe for a third round. Thank you.
So Lieselotte, I think you're on now.
Thank you. First of all, the question about what about the cultural industry in Denmark, the gig workers, self-employed people. And actually, as I mentioned in my presentation, after the tripartite agreement, there was these questions coming up, but what about the cultural workers? What about authors, artists, so forth? And actually then they were included in the tripartite agreement. But of course, when you are self-employed, there is this condition that you have to prove that your turnover has been plummeting 30%, so you actually have a loss. And then the compensation is 70% of your turnover the past 3 months. So there are some other conditions, but they are included under other conditions than companies. Then in relation to the question of migrant workers, I think that's sort of the same answer as for Germany. There are no, I mean, if they are employed in a Danish company, they are included under the same scheme as their Danish colleagues. So there's no difference to that. Then I think there was a question in relation to, I don't think you mentioned it, but I read it under the Q&A. Actually, in the tripartite agreement, there is this requirement that employees take 1 week holiday, meaning that they have to sort of spend one week of their holiday during this COVID-19 support scheme, ensuring that when they come back to work, they will not have like 4 weeks of holiday, but only 3 weeks. So it's a sort of way of making them pay a bit themselves, because there's really no way to go on holiday at the moment. but that's sort of the thinking behind it. Then there was this question about the 70,000 employees, and I think that's, you might, maybe it's my slide, which was a bit confusing. The message was that the Danish government, when they made this tripartite agreement with the social partners, they thought, okay, we might have around 70,000 employees included in this. And as of today, Monday, we have 222,000 employees included. So it has been a huge success, you might call it. And actually, more than 2/3 of these people are employed in export companies. And I think that's high value of Denmark to keep these export production companies. So it's really a proof that it sort of keeps these companies alive. And then I think at the end of this answer, I think it's very, very interesting about the new narratives, as Horst mentioned. I mean, we also talk a lot about the nurses and the doctors and so forth, but walk the talk. Thank you.
Angelo, your turn.
Yeah, let me say that other important workers are the cleaners, because how many of us needs in this moment, how important are the cleaners? It's only to add to the type of jobs that we have to take in consideration and to change the narrative. It's also about cleaners that are so important to clean the workplace, where a lot of workers is still going on this crisis. But let me focus on one thing, that the thing is that this is emergency has highlighted that trade unions' fundamental role, standing in the front line to protect worker rights in this moment and condition. The principle of cooperation and solidarity are more important than ever to ensure we get through this crisis as strongly as possible, because without this we can't do nothing. We are monitoring for example, as Unifinance, we are monitoring the situation and working with our member union across the world to support in the day-to-day activity and to protect finance workers worldwide. But let me say, it's the role of our federation, UNI, also to protect the workers in the service sector. We have seen that our affiliates have been instrumental in either negotiating the measures that have been introduced to control the risk linked to this COVID-19, or have been central in discussion and consultation at the sectoral and company level. We think also that a genuine and constructive consultation, dialogue, and important collective bargaining remain the best tools for resolving problems, finding socially responsible solutions, and guaranteeing that employment and good working conditions, including health and safety measures are maintained and improved. This includes making sure that no company tries to take advantage of the current situation to cut jobs and make working conditions worse. For the future, because we are thinking now about the future, we're also seeking to envision what post-COVID-19 scenario will be to this end. And we are preparing a long-term strategy for the period to come. With the massive use of remote working measures accompanied by closure of branches, work sites all over the world due to this pandemic situation, it is fundamental that we demonstrate how employees are crucial to the sector, in this case in the finance sector. The crisis we are living has shown how continues to show the staunch dedication of the sector workers on the front lines to ensure public access to essential financial services. We need to reflect also on the role of the finance industry plays in society. Instead of prioritizing private shareholder profits, it needs to support the real economy and play a crucial part in public investment and development in the post-crisis period. And then I would like to add that it's also strategic to keep public in countries some assets. For example, the health system show that the public health system works. The education system, school, public school, pension system that was mentioned before by Liz, and research, and also to have a control on, not a control in the sense to be shareholder of finance companies, but to address the finance company to be more responsible in public and to let me say help each country to grow, because we have to reset everything. The economy must be reset, not only in Denmark or Germany, in Italy, in the US, in Japan, in Brazil, everywhere. And the finance sector could be a player more socially responsible. And we need for that the union must push this of course, in the public debate and also in the sector, but also at the national public debate and international debate.
Great. Thanks so much, Angelo. We've got about 10 minutes left to go, so I'm going to turn back to Liz Schuler to make a few concluding remarks before the end of the panel.
This is an exercise in multitasking. I was just about to answer one of the questions on reopening, but I will paste that afterwards. But I just wanted to say again, thank you to the School of Industrial Labor Relations at Cornell, to the Dean, to all of the team and partners, and of course the colleagues who I've been furiously writing notes, Horstman and Lisa and Angelo, and just really wanted to thank those who were tuned in as well. I see people on Twitter talking about this, and really loved the thoughtful questions that everyone posed as we've gone through this morning. I think we have seen, as I said in my opening, that at least in the United States, and I think what I'm hearing all across the globe, that the weaknesses or the cracks in our economies are very much visible. Other countries beyond the US are dealing with them, I would say, in more responsible ways. But again, here in America, we've been actually dealing with this before the crisis hit. And it has now, exposed those cracks for all to see. And when people say, when are we going to return to normal? I often say, I'm not sure we want to return to normal, right? Normal in the US is actually inequality. And normal in the US is disparities for workers of color, for women, for young people. Normal means that we continue to not have paid sick leave in our country, and weak labor laws, and allowing companies to bust unions. and keeping workers from joining together. So that normal, I'm not sure I want to return to, right? And so we're actually looking again to our partners across the globe to solve this problem together. And I think also that extends to other countries where in 24 countries across the world, there are limits on freedom of expression, and 93 countries that inhibit freedom of assembly. So this is what we're talking about. We want a new normal, and we need to coordinate our action, of course, at the global level if we're really going to rebuild the global economy for working people and make sure that workers have good jobs and social protections and a responsible return to work. And I would say I was going to paste in a link to the AFL-CIO has an 8-point plan for working people's safe return to work. And that's something I think we really could, that's tangible, we could coordinate globally. So just to put a fine point on one of the points that I took away is that, yes, workers are in motion right now. And we've, in the body of questions that we've seen this morning, people are saying, what do we do? How do we organize in this moment? And of course, we need to do it in new ways, because we're not organizing face-to-face and door-to-door, and you know, it's not an option right now, but we can't let that hold us back either. So we have to expand our thinking. And I think one of the silver linings to all of us, you know, having to get a little bit more creative about how we work with each other, is that it will enable us to organize more nimbly and using technology, for example. And I wanted to highlight that the AFL-CIO and 26 of our affiliate unions actually, before the crisis, had built a tool called Action Builder. And it was meant more for organizing campaigns in the workplace as we know them traditionally. But I think now it's going to be taking on a whole new level, because we're going to be organizing in concentric circles. We're going to feel more comfortable with our immediate family and friends, and then be expanding out based on sort of our home environment. And I think we can take advantage of that with tools like Action Builder, because these are ways to kind of knit people together based on shared experiences, shared workplaces, your neighborhood, and be able to knit them together using a platform. So I think that tool is going to come in really handy, obviously, for organizing our workplaces, but also to preserve our democracy as we head into this presidential election. This is the way we're going to be organizing on every front. So it's a challenging time. I don't need to tell you that, for the entire world. And that makes it all the more important for us to come together. For the global labor movement, our mission, I think, in the coming weeks, months, years, is to come together, respond to the immediate needs that this crisis has created, but also the long-term planning that we must come together to rewrite the rules of the economy and actually write the new story of our future. So thank you again.
Thank you, Liz. I think that's an incredibly important point to recognize the kind of global nature of the challenges we're facing. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic really represents something that's been around for a long time, pandemics, but in this case, it's traveled around our world with incredible speed in our globalized world, so that we're all facing this challenge together and having to respond. But that's the new normal in some ways, right? Many of our great challenges this day are global in nature. We think about the power of global capital and the impact that has on inequality worldwide. We think about the challenge of climate change, a truly global challenge that we all face. And the responses that we're going to have to make will need to be global in nature. The one hopeful thing, I think, is that the globalization also is globalization of connections, and gives us the ability to have these kind of dialogues where we talk across countries and we engage in a social dialogue, right? Here we're doing a transatlantic social dialogue that is trying to come up with responses that bring the perspective of labor across the world together to think about how best do we deal with these global challenges. COVID-19 today, but the ongoing challenges of inequality and the great challenge of our century of climate change. All of these things, we need to have that labor voice on a global scale coming together to address these challenges. I want to conclude by thanking everybody who's made this happen. You know, when we're connecting from distance to each other, we appreciate more and more the work of those who put together the tools that we use. I want to thank again Deej Goodall and the others in our distance team who help make these things work. We've all, those of us who use Zoom and other tools, appreciate more and more the hard work of the IT and skilled workers who make sure that we know how to use these things and we use them effectively. So big shout out to them, to my colleagues, Dina, Ian, and Jeff have worked hard on this, and especially to our panelists today, Liz Schuler, Horst Mund, Lieselotte Toft, and Angelo Di Cristo. Fascinating comments, I think, really shed a lot of light on what's going on and really showed the value of dialogue in learning from each other. So thank you everybody for participating in the webinar today. We have recorded it, so you'll be able to go back and review some of the points. I think there was some really great information that was shared there. So thank you everybody.